Well, here I am again outside the Victoria Gallery and Museum in the quad that sits just behind the main road with the School of Engineering and other buildings. The university, of course, it's important, the Victoria Gallery and Museum, as it's our red brick building, indeed the very building that coined that phrase, built as a result of donations by Tate. So, why am I here? Well, I want to tell you about a 1970s authority. So the citation is 1971, square brackets, Chancery, page 1, and it's Re West Sussex, which of course is another surplus case, and it's one that perhaps perfects the judgment of Mr. Justice Harman, as he then was, in Re Gillingham. And the case is also important because it takes further forward the ratio in Re Abbott, another case that we've looked at in the equity shorts. So the facts briefly stated are these. The West Sussex Constabulary, the police officers, or you could just hear the bell there of the Victoria Gallery Museum, which hopefully won't put you off what I'm saying. I'll wait for the chimes to be complete before I continue with my exposition. I think they have now completed. Yes, so I was saying that the police officers of the West Sussex Constabulary they're still going. You'll be able to tell what time of day it is by the bongs of the clock. So shortly they'll finish, and then we'll continue when I tell you about these police officers. So the police officers had caused a fund to be raised, which was in essence for the benefit of deceased members, widows and dependents, so a kind of insurance policy against problems. In addition to their own subscriptions, there were also a number of other routes where money came into this fund, and they included, for example, donations that were made through collection boxes, raffles, and then specific larger donations. So the question before Mr. Justice Goff was the extent to which, if there was a surplus, and there was because West Sussex amalgamated with another police force, meaning that this insurance fund, equivalent insurance fund, had a surplus. The question before him was to what extent the surplus should go, pursuant to a resulting trust, back to those donors, those different types of donor that we've just discussed, or that the money should go bona vacantia, that it should go to the Crown. Unlike Mr. Justice Harman in Re Gillingham, Mr. Justice Goff took a more forensic view, and he broke down the different types of donation that were made. So, for example, with the subscriptions for the police officers themselves, the argument was successful that they had peace of mind for those subscriptions, and as a consequence were not able to obtain any redress pursuant to resulting trust, but that instead, after due account had been taken of any monies going to widows or dependents, that the money would become bona vacantia, would go to the Crown. A similar story, that's to say peace of mind, you got what you paid for, applies to the sweepstake people. That's of course because in participating in the sweepstake they were getting a form of enjoyment, so again the money is bona vacantia. But the only differentiation from that general rule, from the raffles and the entertainment, is the large legacies. They were treated in the Re Abbott sense. So any specific large legacies did become imbued with the resulting trust, and were the value, the beneficial interest, sat with the original donor or their estate. And I should say finally, with the collection boxes, again, they also were bona vacantia. That's to say, in placing the money in the collection box, the people obtained some form of enjoyment. So that's Re West Sussex. It's a perfection from Re Gillingham, slightly more forensic. Enjoy the case when you look at it. Think about how it deals with those two previous authorities we've looked at. That's to say, Re Abbott and then Re Gillingham. And then think about the deployment of intention again, particularly with those collection box people and the sweepstake people. To what extent there might we think of a presumed resulting trust or an automatic resulting trust, again in the McGarry sense, or in the Brown-Wilkinson sense, a presumed resulting trust. So from here, the much more quiet setting now of the Victoria Gallery Museum quad, I bid you goodbye. Goodbye. So here we are with our next case in our series of cases on surpluses and resulting trusts. And this case is, of course, Re West Sussex, which is 1971, square brackets, Chancery at page 1. We can see 1969, the hearing dates there, before Mr. Justice Goff, as he then was, of course, in due course, Lord of Appeal in Ordinary. So a very eminent judge. And this case, as we'll see when we mull and descend into the catchwords there a little bit, whether or not there's a resulting trust for the members. And of course, the members were these officers of the West Sussex Constabulary, who had subscribed, as we see from the head note here, to a fund, the purpose of which was to grant allowances to widows and dependents for deceased members. And in addition to their own subscriptions, there was also revenue from other sources, as you can see here, that we've highlighted. So entertainments, raffles and sweepstakes, collecting boxes, and then donations, including legacies. Well, there's an amalgamation of police forces, meaning that there's a surplus, much like we saw in Re Gillingham or indeed Re Abbott before. So after this amalgamation, the question before the court is to what extent that surplus is held for members, or how do the people who donated in these ways receive their money back, if at all, or does it instead go bona vacantia, as to the Crown? So if we move from the head note, or that part of the head note, down towards the judgment element, and we see here that it was held, of course, that there could not be a resulting trust for members since their money had been put up on a contractual basis and not a trust basis. Ergo, that element of the fund was bona vacantia, goes to the Crown. However, interestingly, and perhaps more forensically than was dealt with in Re Gillingham, as we've seen from the previous equity short, here we have an element where we see Re Abbott, again the subject of another equity short, applied. So that case there is applied. So particularly in relation to large donations, there is a resulting trust. So more forensic application. And indeed, just above, as you can see there, with Mr. Justice Harman's judgment, there's the idea that Re Gillingham is not followed in terms of its arguably unsophisticated approach towards the outside contributions, which were largely were held to be largely bona vacantia. And you can see there is the relevant element of the judgment that's been extracted. So if we progress down through the rest of the judgment, we see we've got the cases that were cited and the original facts here. I've highlighted for you some of those donations just to get across the idea of the different ways in which money came into this fund, not just through legacies, not just from the subscriptions by the members, those police officers, but also through perhaps these anonymous sources, which of course are interesting because if they were given anonymously, to what extent did that individual, that donor, really think that they'd ever get any money back if the purposes of the fund stopped? So as we progress down, we get into counsel's argument, as you can see, worth engaging in, just to see the kind of discussion and perhaps, for example, there, the application of previous authority on surplus cases and how those counsel thought that sort of authority should be applied. We're progressing through these previous cases, and in due course you'll see we'll get to the other side's responses, where they mull on how they think those sums should be used. So as we progress down, we then get an interjection by Goff there, and then eventually, though, after he's taken time for consideration of the issues, the judgment of Mr. Justice Goff, which is a lengthy judgment, so spend some time on it, mull on how he uses the previous authorities on the issue that we're looking at, and in particular mull on his use of Re Gillingham and the way in which he dispenses with Re Gillingham. You can see, here we go, here's the first citation to it by him. Anyway, and then as you progress through, try and extract out the salient elements in terms of how you think money should be used. And here we see Goff using counsel's argument there to highlight the different derivation of those sums generally. And again, we progress down some dicta from higher courts that's been used, of course, by the judge, Mr. Justice Goff. Bit more Gillingham critique there, which is interesting. Before finally we get to the conclusion elements, which, as we can see, are that I make the following declarations. First, that the portion attributable to donations and legacies is held on a resulting trust for the donors or their estates and the estates of the respective testators. Secondly, the remainder of the fund is bona vacantia. So an application then of Re Abbott, as we've seen, but then that those other sources, much like in Re Gillingham, are bona vacantia. So that's a very brief whistle-stop tour through the judgment in Re Gillingham. Do have a look at it to see what you think, and in particular mull on how it's progressed or applies to earlier authorities that we've looked at, Re Abbott and then Re Gillingham. So on that note, I will say goodbye. Goodbye.